Okay, here in letter D, we've got y equals secant of 2x minus pi, and so because this is a secant function, I know that I am going to graph a cosine and then just do the reciprocal parts of that. And so starting with the amplitude, that would be 1. The vertical shift is going to be 0, so y equals 0 is going to be my midline. My maximums are going to be at 1, and my minimums will be at -1. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by b, which in this case is 2, and so that will reduce to pi. Remember, that's helpful because it helps me find my x increment, which is period divided by 4, so just pi over 4 in this particular case. And then for the phase shift, we notice that there is a b value, and so you choose which method you prefer for finding the phase shift. I like to factor out b. Some other people might like to set the parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x, and either way we're going to get the same answer. And so if I factor out the 2, that means I'm going to have x minus pi over 2, and so that means my phase shift is going to be positive pi over 2. So I'm going to put that down as my first x coordinate here. Now, from there, I'm going to be adding pi over 4. And I cannot add those fractions if they don't have the same denominator. And so I'm going to multiply this first fraction by a 2 over a 2. And that's going to give me 2 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4. And that is 3 pi over 4. And so that will be my next x value here, 3 pi over 4. Then if I add another 1 pi over 4, that's going to get me to 4 over 4, which I know will reduce to 1 pi. If I add another one, that will give me 5 pi over 4. And then finally 6 pi over 4, which I know will reduce to 3 pi over 2. Okay, real quick, go back and look. We are graphing a cosine function, and so therefore we need to start with a maximum. So up there at 1 at pi over 2, then a 0 at 3 pi over 4, a minimum at pi, another 0 at 5 pi over 4, and finally a maximum at 3 pi over 2. And so at both of these zeros, at 3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4, we will have a vertical asymptote, and then at each maximum and minimum will our graph of secant come off of. So there a half parabola, here a half parabola, and then don't forget the bottom part, which will be a full parabola, so that we have our graph. Okay, exciting example here. There's a lot of things going on in this particular problem, so let's start by recognizing that this is a secant graph, and so therefore I'm going to have to find all of the information for a cosine. And so that would start with the amplitude, which is going to be positive 2. Remember that the negative here is going to force a reflection over the x-axis, which will change all of my maximums to minimums and minimums to maximums. There is no vertical shift in this particular function, and so therefore y equals 0 is going to be my midline, making my amplitude 2, so that's going to be 2 and -2 on the y-axis. Okay, the period here is going to be very interesting because we're going to take 2 pi and we're going to divide by pi over 4, which means that we're going to take 2 pi and multiply it by the reciprocal of pi over 4, which is 4 over pi. The pi's are going to cancel, and so that's going to give me a period of 8. That's going to make my x increment pretty easy because that's just 8 divided by 4, which is equal to 2. And then finally, probably the most challenging part of this is the phase shift. And so if we look at the parentheses, pi over 4 is our b, and so that is what's going to have to be factored out. Now, when I factor out a pi over 4, what I end up doing is taking that number that's in the parentheses and dividing it by what I factored out. And so pi over 2 divided by pi over 4 is going to be pi over 2, so you keep the first fraction or the numerator the same, and then you change it to multiplication and multiply by the reciprocal of the denominator. And so this is going to equal to 2 because the pi's will cancel, and 4 over 2 is 2. Now I kind of did that in a little bit of a inconvenient area because it's right around my graph, and so if that's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and erase this. So go ahead and pause if you need to write down the work I just showed. so that I can erase this. Okay, and so because the phase shift is 2 in this case, that means that my first x-axis value is also going to be 2. And then I'm just counting by 2's. And we all learned how to do that when we were really young. And so 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 are going to be my 5 x-axis values. And now I am ready to graph. And so going back real fast, I know that I'm doing a cosine, except I'm doing a negative cosine. Don't forget that negative way back over here. That means my maximums are going to be minimums, and my minimums are going to be maximums. So instead of starting at a max, I'm going to start at a min, then go to a 0, then a max, then a 0, and then a min. At all of my zeros, I'm going to have vertical asymptotes, so that would be at 4 and at 8. And then at the other points, that's where my secant graph is going to come alive. And so I've got this parabola here. It's going to need to go down and to the right for that half parabola. And then at 6, one full opening up parabola. And then at 10, another downward opening parabola that's going to go back to the left. And so there's my graph here for letter E. Okay, one last example. We've got y equals cosecant of 2x plus pi over 2. And so I noticed that this is a cosecant graph, which means I'm going to have to graph a sine and then do the vertical asymptotes and everything that we've been doing. So 2x plus pi over 2 is the inside here, but the amplitude then is 1 since there's no lead coefficient. The vertical shift is 0 since there's nothing at the outside at the end of the function. And so that means that my y-axis values here will be pretty standard, -1, 0, and 1. The period is going to be 2 pi over b, so 2 pi divided by 2 in this case, which will reduce to pi. And that's helpful because it helps me find my x increment. And so period divided by 4 is just going to be pi over 4. And then finally, the phase shift, again, a little challenging here. I need to factor out the 2. And when I do that, it's essentially like I'm dividing both of these numbers by 2. And so pi over 2 divided by 2 is really just the same thing as pi over 2 times the reciprocal of 2, which is a half, which is going to give me pi over 4. And it's going to be plus pi over 4. And so therefore, my phase shift is going to be negative pi over 4. And so that tells me that I'm going to start over here on the left side at negative pi over 4, and then I'm just going to start adding my x increment, which is pi over 4. So negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4, that's going to be 0, so my next x-axis value will be 0. Add another pi over 4. Another pi over 4 will get you to 2 pi over 4. That will reduce to pi over 2, and then finally 3 pi over 4. Now, go back just real quick. We know that we need to graph a sine function, so we need to do that order of points when we graph this. And so that means we're going to start with a 0, and then go to a max, a 0, a min, and another 0. At each of our 3 zeros, we're going to have vertical asymptotes, so negative pi over 4, positive pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4. And then at my other 2 points, I'm going to have my cosecant graph. So I'm going to do that in red as I've been doing out this whole time. Downward opening parabola here at pi over 2 and an upward opening parabola here at 0. And so if you have any questions on secant or cosecant, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I would be more than happy to help you.